The year is 452 AD. Pope Leo the Hun stands alone on the banks of the Mincio River in northern Italy, his white robes billowing in the wind. Before him stretches an army so vast that their campfires look like a second constellation mirroring the stars above. At the head of this horde sits a man whose very name has become synonymous with destruction, a warlord who has already burned a path of annihilation across the known world, leaving mountains of skulls and rivers of blood in his wake. They call him Attila. The Romans whisper his name like a curse. The Christians call him the Scourge of God, divine punishment made flesh. Mothers across Europe use his name to frighten children into obedience. Behave, or Attila will come for you in the night. But who was this man who made emperors tremble and entire civilizations prepare for extinction? How did a nomadic warrior from the Eurasian steppes bring the mighty Roman Empire to its knees? And what kind of monster, or perhaps strategic genius, could orchestrate destruction on such an apocalyptic scale? If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from. I love knowing that we're exploring these dark secrets of history together, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity. Now let's return to the story. The truth about Attila is somehow more terrifying than the legend, because while history has given us plenty of brutal conquerors, few possessed Attila's combination of savage violence, tactical brilliance, and psychological warfare. He didn't just want to defeat his enemies, he wanted to erase them from existence, to leave behind nothing but ash and memory. This is the story of how one man nearly destroyed Western civilization. Attila was born around 406 AD into a world already soaked in blood. The Huns, his people, were nomadic warriors who had exploded out of Central Asia decades earlier like a plague of human locusts. Unlike the civilized Romans with their marble columns and sophisticated philosophy, the Huns were born in the saddle. Hun children learned to ride before they could walk properly, learned to shoot arrows before they could write their names. Because they couldn't write their names. The Huns had no written language, no permanent settlements, no agriculture. They were the ultimate predators, mobile, merciless, and hungry. Contemporary Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus described them with barely concealed horror. They are so hardy that they need no fire or seasoned food, but live on the roots of wild plants and the half-raw flesh of any sort of animal, which they warm a little by placing it between their thighs and the backs of their horses. He continues, painting a picture of men who seemed barely human. They are certainly in the shape of men, however ugly. But this ugliness was often the result of intentional modification. Hun warriors practiced cranial deformation, binding the skulls of infants to create elongated, alien-looking heads meant to terrify their enemies. They scarred their own faces deliberately, cutting the cheeks of young boys so they would grow up with fearsome, disfigured visages. War wasn't just their profession, it was their identity, written into their very flesh. Young Attila grew up in this culture of ritualized violence. His uncle Rugila ruled the Huns and had already established them as a serious threat to Rome. But when Rugila died in 434 AD, power passed to his two nephews, Attila and his older brother Bleda. For nearly a decade, the brothers ruled jointly, but those who knew them understood the partnership was doomed. Bleda was the conservative one, content with the arrangement they'd extorted from Rome, annual tribute payments of £700 of gold in exchange for peace. It was a protection racket on an imperial scale, and it was making the Huns wealthy. But Attila was different. Ancient sources describe him as shorter than average, with a broad chest, a large head, and small, deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through people. His beard was thin and grey-streaked even in his youth. But what made men fear him wasn't his appearance. It was something behind those eyes. A cold, calculating intelligence paired with an absolute absence of mercy. In 445 AD, Bleda disappeared. The historical record is frustratingly vague about the details, which is often code for something too brutal or shameful to write down explicitly. The official story was simply that Bleda was dead, and Attila was now the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire. But everyone knew the truth. Attila had murdered his own brother, and if he would kill his own blood for power, what would he do to his enemies? Rome was dying, not the quick death of conquest, but the slow rot of imperial decay. The Western and Eastern empires had split, weakening both. Barbarian tribes pressed at every border. The economy was collapsing. The legendary legions were shadows of their former glory, increasingly filled with barbarian mercenaries rather than citizen soldiers. Into this weakness, Attila poured like poison into an open wound. His first move as sole ruler was to double Rome's tribute. Not request, demand. The Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II had no choice but to agree. £700 of gold per year became £1,400. The greatest empire in the world was now paying protection money to a nomadic warlord, and everyone knew it. But Attila understood something fundamental about power. It's not just about what you can take, but what you can make people fear you'll take. He began constructing his empire not through administration or law, but through pure, calculated terror. When a Germanic tribe called the Burgundians refused to submit to Hun authority, Attila didn't just defeat them militarily, he destroyed them as a people. His warriors swept through their territories like a human tsunami, killing every fighting-age man, enslaving the women and children, and burning every settlement until nothing remained but scorched earth. The Burgundians who survived were so traumatized that their culture never recovered. They exist now only as a footnote in history, erased by Attila's deliberate genocide. The Scythians, once mighty warriors themselves, suffered a similar fate. Attila's methodology was brutally consistent. Surround the enemy, cut off all escape routes, then systematically slaughter them. His warriors would compete to see who could kill the most enemies, keeping tally with severed heads. They would impale prisoners on stakes and leave them writhing in agony for days as warnings to others. They would tie captives to horses and drag them across the steppes until their bodies disintegrated. This wasn't war as the Romans understood it. This was extermination. By the late 440s, Attila commanded an empire stretching from the steppes of Central Asia to the Rhine River. His army wasn't just Huns anymore. It was a coalition of conquered peoples, each tribe forced to supply warriors or face annihilation. Goths, Gepids, Heruli, Sarmatians, and dozens of other peoples marched under the Hun banner, united by fear of their master. Ancient sources claim Attila could field armies of 500,000 men. This is likely an exaggeration. Logistics would make such numbers nearly impossible. But even if the real number was 1/5 of that, it was still the largest military force Western Europe had seen in generations. And in 447 AD, Attila pointed this army at the Eastern Roman Empire. The invasion of the Eastern Roman Empire was a masterpiece of systematic devastation. Attila didn't want territory. He could barely control what he already had. He wanted to break Eastern Rome so completely that they would never dare refuse his demands again. The Hunnic horde swept across the Balkans like a wildfire through dry grass. City after city fell. Marcianopolis, a thriving commercial centre, was sacked and burned. The inhabitants were given a choice: enslave yourself to the Huns or die. Most chose wrong. The Huns herded thousands of citizens into the city's amphitheatre and set it ablaze, burning them alive while Hun warriors watched and laughed at the screams. Philippopolis suffered worse. When the city refused to open its gates, Attila ordered his engineers, yes, the primitive Huns had sophisticated siege engineers, to undermine the walls. When the defences collapsed, his warriors poured through like a flood of steel and hate. They raped and murdered indiscriminately, every man, woman and child. The Huns had a practice of making pyramids from the heads of their victims, cementing them together with blood and mud. At Philippopolis they built one so large it was visible from miles away, a monument to atrocity: Arcadiopolis, Serdica, Ratiaria. The names roll off like a litany of the damned. Each city represented thousands of lives ended in terror and agony. The Huns would sometimes play games with their captives, forcing parents to choose which of their children would die first, or making men fight to the death with their bare hands for the privilege of being sold into slavery rather than executed on the spot. Emperor Theodosius II, safe behind the mighty walls of Constantinople, was powerless to stop it. His armies were defeated in every engagement. At the Battle of the Eutus River, the Romans lost over 10,000 men in a single afternoon. The survivors fled in such panic that they drowned in the river, weighed down by their own armour. Contemporary historian Callinicus wrote, "There was so much killing and bloodletting that no one could number the dead. The Huns pillaged the churches and monasteries, and slew the monks and virgins in great quantities. Another source described how the roads were covered with corpses and the rivers ran red with blood for days. This wasn't hyperbole. When you kill tens of thousands of people over the course of months, rivers actually do run red. The decomposing bodies actually do line the roads. The scale of death becomes so vast it stops being individual tragedies and becomes geography, landscape features mapped in corpses. Constantinople itself seemed doomed. The Huns reached the walls and began their siege preparations. The greatest city in Christendom, the crown jewel of civilization, home to 500,000 people, was about to fall to savages who couldn't read or write. But Attila had a problem. He couldn't take Constantinople. The walls were too strong, too well designed. The Theodosian walls were architectural marvels, triple layers of fortifications that had never been breached. Attila could destroy everything around Constantinople, but he couldn't touch the city itself. So he did what any rational monster would do. He demanded an impossible ransom to go away. The negotiations were humiliating for Rome. The tribute was tripled again, to £300 of gold per year. Every escaped Hun prisoner had to be returned or ransomed at 12 gold coins each. Roman envoys had to stand in Attila's presence while he remained seated, a deliberate insult that symbolized Rome's subordinate status. Theodosius agreed to everything. He had no choice. The Eastern Empire was bled white, its Balkan provinces devastated so thoroughly that some areas wouldn't recover for centuries. Entire cities vanished from history, their populations murdered or scattered, their buildings reduced to rubble. Attila rode back to his capital, a massive tent city in the Hungarian plains, laden with gold and slaves, having proven beyond any doubt that he could destroy the Eastern Empire whenever he chose. But Attila's appetite for destruction had only grown. Eastern Rome was cowed. It was time to turn his gaze westward. The excuse Attila needed to invade Western Europe came from the most unlikely source: a desperate Roman princess. Honoria was the sister of Western Emperor Valentinian III, and she hated her life. As an imperial princess, she was a political pawn, destined to be married off to secure some alliance she didn't care about. She was under constant surveillance, her every movement controlled. When palace guards discovered she was having an affair with her chamberlain, a shocking scandal, Valentinian was furious. He had the chamberlain executed and planned to marry Honoria off to some boring loyal senator who would keep her under control. In desperation, Honoria did something either brilliantly manipulative or stunningly naive. She sent her ring to Attila with a letter asking for his help with her situation. Attila's response was immediate and audacious. He declared that Honoria's ring was a marriage proposal, which he accepted. As her husband-to-be, he demanded half the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. It was absurd, transparent, obviously just a pretext for invasion. But Attila didn't care if anyone believed it. He had his excuse, and that was enough. But there was another motivation too. The Western Empire had stopped paying tribute after Theodosius II's death in 450 AD. The new Eastern Emperor, Marcian, was made of sterner stuff and had refused to continue the payments. Without Eastern gold flowing in, Attila needed a new source of wealth to maintain his empire and feed his armies. And so, in 451 AD, Attila assembled the largest army he had ever commanded and marched west. The Hunnic horde crossed the Rhine River in early 451 AD. What followed was perhaps the most devastating military campaign Western Europe had ever seen. The Huns moved with terrifying speed, covering up to 50 miles per day, unheard of for armies of that era. They didn't bother with supply lines because they lived off the land, which is a polite way of saying they stole everything and murdered anyone who resisted. Metz was the first major city to fall. The Huns surrounded it on April 7, 451 AD, a date remembered because it was the day after Easter. The timing was deliberate. Attila wanted to shatter Christian morale by destroying them during their holiest season. The sack of Metz was thorough. The Huns scaled the walls in the pre-dawn darkness and opened the gates from within. What followed was a 48-hour orgy of violence. Every building was looted, every church was desecrated. The Huns had a special hatred for Christianity, seeing it as a religion for the weak. They would drag priests from their altars and behead them with their own ceremonial knives. they would force nuns to strip naked and dance for Hun warriors before being raped and killed. By the time the Huns left Metz, it was a smoking ruin. Of the city's estimated 20,000 inhabitants, fewer than 1,000 survived. Those who lived did so because they were valuable as slaves. Reims fell next, then Auxerre. Troyes barely escaped destruction when its bishop, Lupus, rode out to negotiate with Attila personally, an act of either incredible courage or suicidal stupidity. According to legend, Lupus fell to his knees and begged Attila to spare the city. Attila, for reasons no one quite understands, agreed, but only after taking a massive tribute and hostages, including Bishop Lupus himself. But the real target was Paris. The city was smaller then, confined to the Ile de la Cité, but it was symbolically important. If Paris fell, all of Gaul would be open to the Huns. As the Hunnic army approached, panic gripped the city. Thousands fled, but according to legend, a young woman named Geneviève, later St. Geneviève, convinced the remaining population to stay and pray. Whether through divine intervention or sheer luck, Attila bypassed Paris and continued south toward Orléans. The siege of Orléans began on June 14th, 451 AD. The city's walls were strong, but the Huns had siege towers, battering rams and infinite patience. They bombarded the walls day and night with captured Roman artillery. Hun arrows fell like lethal rain. The defenders knew that when the walls fell, not if when, they would all die screaming. But help was coming. The Western Roman general Flavius Aetius had been frantically assembling an army to face Attila. Aetius was a fascinating figure himself. He'd actually spent time as a hostage with the Huns in his youth, and knew Attila personally. Some sources suggest they'd been friends once, but personal history didn't matter now. Aetius had done something unprecedented. He'd formed an alliance between Rome and its traditional enemies: Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, Alans, Saxons. Barbarian tribes that usually fought Rome or each other now marched together against the common threat. Because everyone understood, if Attila won, there would be nothing left to fight over. On June 20th, 451 AD, Aetius's army reached Orléans just as the walls were failing. The Huns fell back, and one of history's most important battles became inevitable. The two armies met near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne on a broad plain that would soon be drenched in blood. Ancient sources claim 500,000 men fought there, which is certainly exaggerated, but it was still one of the largest battles of the ancient world. Attila was reportedly uneasy. He'd consulted his shamans, who read the future in the entrails of animals and patterns of smoke. They predicted a great leader would die in the coming battle. Attila assumed it would be Aetius and pressed forward. The battle began in the afternoon and raged until nightfall and beyond. The fighting was savage, primitive, desperate. Men hacked at each other with swords and axes. Cavalry charges smashed into infantry formations. The Visigothic king Theodoric the Wine was killed in the fighting, trampled to death in the chaos or struck down by a spear. Sources disagree. His son Thorismund took command and fought with the fury of vengeance. The Huns found themselves pushed back, compressed into their own fortified camp. Attila, facing possible defeat for the first time in his career, ordered a massive funeral pyre built from saddles. He would burn himself alive rather than be captured, and take as many enemies with him as possible. But Aetius made a strange decision. He didn't press the attack. As night fell and the battlefield became a landscape of groaning wounded and scavenging animals, Aetius let Attila escape. Why? Some historians think Aetius wanted Attila alive as a counterweight to the Goths, maintaining a balance of power. Others think he simply lacked the strength to finish the fight. Still others whisper that Aetius and Attila, old friends turned enemies, couldn't quite bring themselves to end it. Whatever the reason, Attila retreated back across the Rhine. The invasion of Gaul had failed. Estimates of casualties range from 100,000 to 300,000, so many dead that the battlefield reeked of death for years afterward, and locals avoided it, saying the ghosts of the slain still fought there at night. But Attila wasn't done, not by a long shot. In 452 AD, Attila returned with vengeance on his mind. If he couldn't have Gaul, he would take Italy. He would sack Rome itself and prove once and for all that no one could stop him. The Hunnic army poured over the Julian Alps like a human avalanche. The first city in their path was Aquileia. one of the richest cities in northern Italy. Aquileia was so wealthy, so fortified, that some called it Roma Secunda, the Second Rome. The siege lasted months. The Aquileians fought desperately, knowing their fate if the walls fell. They hurled stones and boiling oil on the attackers. They sallied forth in surprise attacks. They prayed to every god and saint they knew. It wasn't enough. When Aquileia finally fell, Attila was furious at the delay. He ordered his men to show no mercy. None. What happened next was genocide. The Huns killed every living thing in Aquileia. Men, women, children, dogs, horses, even livestock. They burned every building. They tore down the walls stone by stone. They diverted rivers to flood the ruins. By the time they finished, Aquileia had been literally erased from the landscape. Archaeological excavations show that the city's destruction was so complete that it never recovered. Modern Aquileia is a small town built near, but not on, the ancient site, because the original city was obliterated so thoroughly there was nothing left to build on. Refugees from Aquileia fled into the coastal lagoons, where they built settlements on muddy islands to escape the Huns. These settlements would eventually grow into Venice. One of the world's most beautiful cities owes its existence to Attila's brutality. Padua fell next, then Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, Milan, second only to Rome itself, opened its gates without a fight, hoping to be spared. Attila took everything of value and left the city standing but gutted, a ghost of its former glory. The road to Rome was open, and Rome was defenceless. Emperor Valentinian III had already fled to Ravenna. The army was in shambles. The city's population was in full panic. This was it. The Eternal City, the heart of Western civilization, the centre of Christendom, was about to fall to barbarians. And that's when Pope Leo then decided to do something insane. He would meet Attila personally and convince him to turn back. On the banks of the Mincio River, one of history's most famous encounters took place. Pope Leo, flanked by a small retinue of priests, faced the Scourge of God himself. What was said between them, we'll never know for certain. No one recorded the actual conversation, but we know the result. Attila turned his army around and left Italy. Why? Christian tradition says it was a miracle, that Attila saw visions of St. Peter and St. Paul with flaming swords, threatening him with death if he touched Rome. Raffaello's famous painting depicts this scene: Leo, radiant and holy, with warrior saints hovering above him. But the reality was probably more mundane and more interesting. Leo offered Attila an enormous bribe: gold, precious objects, anything the church had. He probably also pointed out that Attila's army was exhausted, disease-ridden, and far from home. The Eastern Empire was threatening to attack from behind if Attila stayed in Italy. And most importantly, Leo reminded Attila of something crucial. Alaric the Visigoth had sacked Rome in 410 AD and died shortly afterward. Superstitious Romans believed Rome had a curse that killed anyone who violated it. Attila, for all his brutality, was deeply superstitious. He believed in signs, omens, and prophecies. His shamans had predicted a great leader would die in battle, and Theodoric had died at the Catalonian plains, not Attila, suggesting the prophecies weren't infallible. Whatever Leo said, whatever combination of threats, bribes, and supernatural warnings he employed, it worked. Attila took the treasure and left. It was the greatest diplomatic victory in papal history. Pope Leo thus became Leo the Great. The church gained prestige and political power that would shape European history for centuries. But for Attila, leaving Italy was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. He swore he would return the next year with an even larger army and finish what he'd started. Rome's reprieve was temporary, except Attila never got the chance. In 453 AD, the year following his withdrawal from Italy, Attila decided to take another wife. He'd had multiple wives already. Polygamy was common among Hun nobility, but this one was supposed to be special. Her name was Ildiko, and she was young, beautiful, and by some accounts a Burgundian princess offered as tribute. The wedding feast was legendary. Attila drank vast quantities of wine, unusual for him as he was typically moderate, and celebrated late into the night. Finally, he retired to his bedchamber with his new bride. The next morning, Attila didn't emerge. His guards waited nervously. Hours passed. Finally, concerned by the silence, they broke down the door. They found Attila dead on his bed, lying in a pool of his own blood. Ildiko sat nearby, terrified, unharmed. What killed the Scourge of God? The official explanation was a nosebleed. Attila suffered a hemorrhage, possibly from drinking too much, possibly from an aneurysm, choked on his own blood, and died. But many suspected Ildiko had murdered him, slipping a knife between his ribs while he slept, avenging all the daughters of Burgundy he'd enslaved and killed. The truth? We'll never know. The Huns burned his body according to their customs, destroying any forensic evidence. The Huns cut their faces and wept blood in mourning, literally reopening the ritual scars they'd inflicted in childhood. They buried Attila in a triple coffin of gold, silver and iron, along with weapons, treasure, and the enslaved workers who dug the grave, killed to keep the location secret. Legend says they diverted a river to hide his burial site. To this day, no one has found Attila's tomb. Without Attila, the Hunnic Empire collapsed almost immediately. His sons fought each other for supremacy. The conquered peoples rebelled. Within a generation, the Huns had vanished from history almost as quickly as they'd appeared, absorbed into other tribes or scattered back to the steppes. But Attila's legacy lived on in terror. For centuries, European parents used his name to scare children. Chronicles described him as barely human, a demon given flesh, divine punishment for humanity's sins. The title, Scourge of God, became permanent. Medieval writers couldn't decide if Attila had been an instrument of God's wrath or Satan's champion. Maybe he was both. Maybe in that particular historical moment they were the same thing. The destruction Attila wrought was so complete that it changed the course of civilization. The Balkans were depopulated for centuries. Italy's economic collapse accelerated the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which would officially end just 23 years after Attila's death. The power vacuum his campaigns created allowed new kingdoms to emerge: the Franks, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, reshaping Europe's political landscape. Some historians argue that without Attila, the transition from ancient to medieval Europe would have been slower, less violent. Others claim he was merely a symptom of Rome's decay, not its cause. But everyone agrees on one thing: Attila was one of history's most effective destroyers. He killed hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. He erased cities and entire peoples. He terrorized a continent. And he did it all through a combination of brilliant military strategy, psychological warfare, and pure, unrestrained brutality. So who was Attila, really? He was a military genius who understood logistics, intelligence gathering, and combined arms warfare better than almost any commander of his era. He knew when to negotiate and when to slaughter. He played the Eastern and Western empires against each other like a grandmaster playing chess. But he was also a sadist who built pyramids from human heads, a man who ordered babies tossed into fires and laughed at the screams, a warlord who saw cities not as conquests but as targets for extermination. Modern scholarship has tried to rehabilitate Attila's image, pointing out that contemporary sources were written by his enemies and likely exaggerated his cruelty. Some historians note that by the standards of his time, Attila wasn't unusually brutal. Medieval warfare was universally savage. But this argument rings hollow when you look at the archaeological evidence. Cities that never recovered, mass graves, the genetic bottlenecks in European populations that suggest massive die-offs in the mid-5th century. The sheer scale of destruction speaks for itself. Attila didn't just want to defeat his enemies, he wanted to erase them, and very often, he succeeded. In Hungarian mythology, Attila is remembered as a hero, a great king who made the world tremble. In Turkish tradition, he's Attil, a legendary warrior. But in most of Europe, his name remains synonymous with devastation. There's a Latin saying, "Where Attila's horse treads, no grass grows." It's probably apocryphal, but it captures something true about how he's remembered. As a force of nature, a human cataclysm, the embodiment of destruction itself. The Pope stood on the banks of that river and faced the monster, and somehow, incredibly, he convinced the monster to turn away. It's a scene that's been painted, sculpted, and dramatized countless times. The triumph of faith over brutality, civilization over savagery, mercy over wrath. But here's what those paintings never show: the tens of thousands already dead, the cities already burned, the children already enslaved, the cultures already extinguished. Attila turned away from Rome, but his work was already done. The Western Roman Empire was mortally wounded, the ancient world was dying, and a new, darker age was being born in blood and fire. And at the centre of it all was a short, broad-chested man with piercing eyes and a genius for destruction. A man who proved that one sufficiently ruthless individual, in the right time and place, can alter the course of human history. They called him the Scourge of God, and for 20 years, that's exactly what he was. The next time you hear someone casually described as Attila the Hun in comparison, a tough boss, a demanding teacher, a strict parent, remember what that actually means. Remember the rivers running red. Remember the pyramids of severed heads. Remember a continent trembling in terror. Remember that some monsters are real, and they don't always get defeated. Sometimes they die in bed, unpunished, having gotten away with everything. That's the real horror of Attila's story. Not that such evil existed, but that it almost won.